Great. Yes, so again, welcome back. It is my great pleasure to chair this keynote and introduce our speaker, Kristin Mann. Kristin Mann is a Professor Emerita at Emory University. She is a historian of Africa and the Black Atlantic world. Her research interests include the birth and transformation of Lagos, Nigeria as an Atlantic port, slavery, the trade in enslaved people, abolition and emancipation, West African commercial and agricultural transformations in the age of European empire, gender, household, labor and domesticity, and the making of the African diaspora. Her work is highly relevant, not only to specialists of Lagos. Her methodologically rigorous and theoretically innovative work emphasizes the unique elements in Lagos history, while at the same time placing the city as an important node in larger regional, imperial, Atlantic, and global networks. And to just give a brief insight into her extensive scholarship, in 1985, she published with Marrying Well, Marriage, Status and Social Change Among the Educated Elite in Colonial Lagos, a landmark study of marriage among the Lagosian elite during the colonial era, a pioneering book that ruptured conceptions of marriage and social mobility. In 1991, she co-edited Law in Colonial Africa, which brings together research in anthropology, history, and critical legal studies, and which has reshaped the field of legal history in Africa. Her 2007 book, Slavery and the Birth of an Atlantic City, Lagos 1760 to 1900, uncovers the relationship between slavery and the growth of one of Africa's most vibrant cities. And for this in-depth magisterial study and its contribution to the field, the Gilda Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University recognized her work as a finalist for the prestigious Frederick Douglass Prize. Kristin Mann is currently completing a book, Transatlantic Lives, Slavery and Freedom in West Africa and Brazil, that pioneers a new approach to the recovery of enslaved Africans' transatlantic biographies. It probes how in the 19th century, groups of Yoruba speakers were able to free themselves, return to Lagos and other towns on the West African coast, reconnect with kin and country folk, and create new homelands. And it is clear that this promises to continue what unites all of her work: scholarship which gives agency to a wide range of historical actors and unearths compelling human stories. So we are very excited and wish to very warmly welcome Kristin Mann for her keynote, Subaltern Perspectives on Circulation, Encounter, and the Mutable Materialities of Gender, Race, and Class in a 19th Century Atlantic Port, a View from Lagos. And with this, I would like to hand over to you, Kristin.
Thank you, Yvonne, Katarina, and the other members of the GPAGH Steering Committee for the invitation to participate in this conference. When I received the invitation and I read the prospectus, I had a visual response. I felt excited. As I thought, I realized that the project described in the prospectus, I thought it would be very generative. For me, I thought I would learn, but it also seemed to be a wonderful way to open up new insights into the intersections among ports, colonialism, other oceanic spaces, and culture, particularly through the lens of materiality and its intersections with race, gender, and class. The Global Cafe last week and the panels this morning have not disappointed. I'm very excited to meet all of you and to learn about your rich and wonderful research. The Port of Lagos developed in a space where the marine, the riverine, and the terrestrial meet. Geography and ecology shaped the origins of the settlement and its development into first an Atlantic and now a global port. The dispersed settlement that evolved into the town of Lagos began on an island, only about 1 mile wide and 3 miles long, at the center of a large lagoon and network of rivers and creeks that stretched for about 400 miles along the coast of West Africa, parallel to the Atlantic Ocean. This inland waterway was fed by seasonally navigable rivers such as the Ogun flowing in from the north, and it was separated from the ocean by a narrow outer bank. The island lay opposite the only break in the long outer bank, where fresh water flowing south from the mainland commingled with tidal salt water from the sea. The island had formed as sand and soil from the littoral and mainland were deposited at the mouth of the lagoon. Its land was low-lying, swampy, and not good for agriculture. Initial settlers lived by fishing, salt making, and trade. The placid inland waterway connecting the mainland to the sea facilitated canoe-borne circulation, encounter, and commercial and cultural exchanges among the peoples of the mainland, some of whom are identified on this map. Before the 16th century, Awori, the southernmost of West Africa's Yoruba-speaking people, migrated to the island seeking refuge from war. These immigrants intermarried with one another, recognized a paramount ruler who claimed descent from Ile-Ife, the cradle of Yoruba civilization, and introduced Yoruba cosmology, religion, and culture, which became hegemonic. The Awori and other immigrants from the west, north, and east expanded trade. The island and its main settlement became a crossroads connecting peoples of the littoral to those of the mainland to the north. At the beginning of the 16th century, Portuguese ships began to arrive from Europe. Their sailors penetrated the lagoon behind Lagos and began trading with the prosperous Ijebu people on the mainland, where they bought cloth, ivory, and enslaved Africans. These early Portuguese designated the area Lagos, or lake, on their maps, bequeathing the island a name that endured among Europeans. Now I can only say, in the middle of that century, the Portuguese largely abandoned Ijebu in favor of the more powerful kingdom of Benin to the east. Benin's located over here. Benin's encounter with the Portuguese could form the subject of another paper with much to say about materiality and provenance. Now, I can say only that by the middle of the 16th century, the Oba of Benin was sufficiently aware of Lagos's growing commercial and geopolitical importance that he sent warriors in canoes along the lagoon to conquer and to colonize it. Ultimately, he didn't succeed, but his efforts gave birth to a monarchy, and his representatives founded a new ruling dynasty. Benin political and cultural influence survived in Lagos into the 19th century. Moreover, either the Beni or the earlier Awori migrants bequeathed the settlement an alternative indigenous name, Eko. The slave trade between ports along the littoral of the Bight of Benin and the Americas took off in the final quarter of the 17th century, as you can see illustrated in this first table. Look at the big jump between these two 25-year periods. For the first 50 years of this period, Ouida, about 60 miles west of Lagos, dominated the trade. From around 1726, however, commerce began shifting east from Ouida, first to Porto Novo, and Badagry, and finally to Lagos, as European traders sought new ports freer of the tight control that the king of Dahomey exercised at Ouida. An Oba of Lagos named Akin Shemoyin is said to have brought the first European slave traders to the town in the 1870s when he returned from exile near Badagry. Until the abolition of their national trades between the 1790s and 1808, British and French merchants traded with Lagos. But even in those early years, Portuguese and Brazilians exported the largest number of enslaved Africans and the region. A freed African slave from Bahia named João de Oliveira claimed to have opened the commerce at Lagos. From the 1820s, Lagos became the most active slaving port along the Bight of Benin and indeed north of the equator. Why did it supplant ports to the west? In the early decades of the 19th century, the large and powerful Oyo Empire in the hinterland of Lagos, which had incorporated or was exacting tribute from a number of previously autonomous Yoruba kingdoms, collapsed and fell. Wars that accompanied and followed the decline of the empire led to the enslavement of large numbers of Yoruba-speaking and other African peoples. It was in this period that very large numbers of Yoruba speakers entered the Atlantic commerce. This is the period of the Yoruba Wars. And you can see that while there were some Yoruba speakers who were sold into the commerce in the second half of the 18th century, prior to that time, their numbers were really small. Their numbers were small in the very period that the trade was expanding so greatly from the Bight of Benin as a whole. I want to reflect in this middle portion of my address on breakout theme 1 from the Global Cafe, materiality and commodities and/or consumption, during the years when the trade in enslaved Africans from Lagos reached its peak between 1820 and 1851. Wait a minute, you may say, Lagos wasn't then a colonial port. The kingdom remained independent until 1861 when Britain annexed it. For such an objection, I'll say in advance, enslaved Africans were the commodity that called the port into being. The materiality of the enslaved was primary in Lagos's birth as a port and as a city. For almost 100 years, human beings were the most important commodity leaving the port for consumption overseas, and they were consumed. Slaves suffered the highest disease and mortality rates in every society in the Americas where they lived. In few places did slave populations reproduce themselves. An ongoing supply of fresh imports from Africa was necessary to sustain slavery in most places, including in Brazil and Cuba. These cruel truths shouldn't be ignored when talking about Lagos's origins as a port. Furthermore, two of the three most important commodities exchanged for enslaved Africans at Lagos, cane spirits and molasses-laced third-grade tobacco, came from Bahia, which had been incorporated into the Portuguese Empire centuries before. Some of the third most important export commodities traded for slaves, cotton, textiles, came from parts of South Asia within the British Empire as late as the 1820s. Empire and the materialities of commodities and consumption were intertwined in Lagos long before Britain colonized the port. It'd be worthwhile to probe the materiality of other commodities passing in and out of the port in the era of the slave trade: spirits, tobacco, and especially textiles, the latter of which were the single most important import exchanged for enslaved Africans, and later also palm produce. They were also the second most important export from Lagos between the 1820s and the 1850s. Given my limited time, I'll restrict my remarks to the materiality of the enslaved themselves, and only while they were in Africa. I won't have time to extend the analysis into and across the Atlantic. To start, I want to sketch some of the basic characteristics of the slave trade at Lagos between 1820 and 1851. First, by that time, it was largely illegal. Even so, an extensive contraband trade continued to Brazil and Cuba. Between 1821 and 1850, about 90% as many enslaved Africans, about 240,000, were exported from the Bight of Benin as during the previous 30 years, and the percentage would have been higher for the port of Lagos itself. In the 1820s, when the Yoruba Wars were increasing the number of Yoruba speakers sold into the commerce, about 75% of the enslaved Africans forcibly embarked from the port were taken to Bahia, mostly in ships that had left from there. At that time, some captains and supercargoes continued the older practice of bulking their human cargo on shipboard. They dropped anchor off Lagos, bought enslaved Africans in small lots from African traders, and loaded them soon after purchase. The enslaved waited on shipboard while a full cargo was assembled. By the 1820s, however, big Bahian merchants or their agents had also begun constructing what they euphemistically called fetorias, or factories, in the port for bulking enslaved Africans on shore. This mode of operation helped them dodge the seizure of their ships by British naval cruisers that policed the illegal slave trade along the West African coast, and it had proven highly efficient elsewhere. The shift from ship to shore as a site for bulking enslaved Africans prior to embarkation lengthened the time they spent on shore in the port and made it much more difficult. In the 1830s, after Brazil passed legislation outlawing its slave trade, there was a temporary lull in the commerce from Lagos to Bahia, while that to Cuba expanded. However, at that time, in the 30s, there was substantial cooperation in the commerce to Cuba among Brazilians, Portuguese, and Spaniards in Bahia, Cuba, and on the West African coast, in what Luis Nicolau Pares has called a hemispheric alliance of interests. During the 40s, the trade to Bahia took off again, while that to Cuba dwindled. Moreover, Rio merchants began sending slaving vessels to the port virtually for the first time. Overall, the number of enslaved Africans shipped from the port more than doubled from the 1820s and rose by 60% over the 1830s. And this slide shows you estimated slave exports from selected ports along the Bight of Benin, and you can see the substantial growth in the trade in the 1840s. The big expansion of the trade during that decade, during the 1840s, and further changes in its commerce introduced to skirt abolition, increased the size and diversity of the Lusophone population in the port, both the Brazilians and the Portuguese, and Portuguese-speaking Africans as well. Several new large-scale operators arrived from Bahia and constructed fetorias on the island, some of which could hold up to 5,000 slaves. To reduce the risk posed by the seizure of their vessels, Bahian merchants also began shipping trade goods to Lagos on one vessel, and the enslaved Africans they were used to buy back to Bahia on another. Moreover, they often spread the shipment of their human cargo across multiple voyages. These practices opened new opportunities in the trade to mid and small scale traders, both freeborn Brazilians and freed Africans and Creoles. I'll illustrate this phenomenon with a single example. In April 1844, 36 men loaded 311 enslaved Africans, 193 men and 118 women, onto the Santa Ana, a small Portuguese ship. And here you see the manifest of the Santa Ana, list of individuals who loaded slaves onto that ship. 56.9% of the cargo was loaded by two men, two Brazilians, Andre Pinto de Silveira and D.J. de Costa Sierras. 56% of the loaders shipped only one or two captives. The modal number of slaves loaded by any one individual was 2. Small-scale traders had since the 18th century sailed back and forth between Bahia and ports along the Bight of Benin in pursuit of profits. In addition, Mary Hicks, whose forthcoming book, Captivity's Commerce, Black Mariners in the World of South Atlantic Slavery, I commend to you, has shown that enslaved Africans were commonly employed on slaving vessels as seamen, barber surgeons, artisans, and commercial assistants. By custom, these Africans enjoyed rights to transport trade goods back and forth and earnings from trade. Many used the income to free themselves. Some of the freedmen continued to work in the transatlantic slave trade on a small scale. For example, 5 of the loaders on the Santa Ana were African freedmen. Here you see the name of Pedro Pacheco, who was originally a Hausa who was enslaved and sold possibly through the port of Lagos to Bahia. He was bought by a slave trader. He ended up working in the transatlantic slave trade. He freed himself. And here you see he was loading one slave onto the Santa Ana in 1844. The movement of enslaved Africans who worked and the freed Africans who traveled on slave ships back and forth between Bahia and Lagos added a new dimension to the history of circulation, encounter, and exchange between the two places. These Africans were in the forefront of transporting goods, African textiles, palm oil, cola nuts, baskets, gourds, beads, ritual items. From the continent to Brazil, and goods that were essential to the recreation of Yoruba and other African cultures there. Moreover, they carried knowledge and information back and forth that enabled Africans and communities separated by warfare, capture, and enslavement to maintain connections across the ocean. In the 1840s, a number of such men settled in Lagos, where they became the founding cohort of the now globally famous Afro-Brazilian community in the town. One of those who returned was this man, Pedro Pacheco. I'll say more about these returnees in a minute. For the moment, into the hinterland to probe materialities of the enslaved. As I do so, I'll tease out intersections with gender, class, and race to deal ethically with the question of how it mattered when the commodity leaving the port was human beings. It's essential to foreground the experience of the enslaved. While there were other means of enslavement, most of those who passed through the port of Lagos between 1820 and 1851 were captured in warfare, many in the Yoruba Wars. First-hand narratives of capture show that the experience was violent and traumatic. The young Samuel Ajay Crowther described enemy attackers driving his family from its secure home. He wrote of women fleeing with infants on their backs, other children clinging to their arms, and loads on their heads. Foes pursued them until they were overtaken, lassoed, and tied together like goats. Separation from loved ones then dealt heavy emotional blows. Joseph Wright's graphic description of the destruction of his hometown, Owu, observed that many of its male warriors and leaders were tortured and killed rather than captured. Both writers acknowledge the impact of this initial violence and trauma on their minds and bodies. The majority of the enslaved Africans who arrived in Lagos from the hinterland had been sold at least once en route. Many had changed hands multiple times. They had already experienced the dehumanizing, stripping, oiling, and display of their bodies. They had endured the close examination of their teeth, skin, arms, legs, trunks, and genitalia by African strangers, and in many cases witnessed haggling over the value of their beings in trade goods. In some, they had already suffered commodification. Appalling for all, the shame and humiliation felt by the upper classes, royals, chiefs, priests, priestesses, may have been particularly painful. War captives could be ransomed by kin and friends with resources, before sale and thus spared enslavement. This practice privileged captives of high status. Even so, it's clear from narratives and biographies of the enslaved that many who were rich and powerful or came from such families were sold into the Atlantic commerce. The slave trade was in that regard a great leveler. Class could not always protect or spare one. Gender, on the other hand, winnowed the enslaved. Females were in greater demand inside Africa than males because of the value of the gendered labor they performed in food processing, trading, and craft manufacturing. Their gender spared some enslaved women and girls from sale into the Atlantic commerce at the coast. To reach the port of Lagos, Africans enslaved in the hinterland had to walk distances that ranged from dozens to hundreds of kilometers. En route, some men and women experienced periods of enslavement inside Africa, affecting the duration of their journeys to the coast. While walking, both males and females commonly were made to carry loads averaging 60 pounds on their heads. The enslaved labored as porters while simultaneously transporting themselves south for sale. Females sometimes in addition carried children, increasing the weight they bore. Women walked while pregnant. Day after day, the enslaved are given food and water sufficient only to keep them going. Many suffered from dehydration, malnutrition, or more egregious illnesses. The weak were sometimes abandoned to die, creating more memories of loss and suffering. In markets on the northern shore of the lagoon, the survivors were sold after another examination and more haggling to traders from Lagos. These Lagos traders then loaded the enslaved into huge canoes that could carry up to 100 men, women, and children at a time to the port. Slave narratives capture the terror that this last phase of the passage to the port struck in the hearts of many. Few had ever before seen such a vast body of water or such enormous canoes crammed with human and other trade goods. An awkward move might lead to a fall overboard, a collective resistance to a disastrous capsizing. Death by drowning was a real fear, as few of the enslaved knew how to swim. Crowther remembered that the sight of the water so terrified him that he barely moved during his overnight journey to Lagos. When they arrived in the port, most of the enslaved were owned by African traders. The young Samuel Ajay Crowther was allowed to move about freely during this period. The water encircling the island constituted an effective barrier to escape. Both males and females were commonly made to work for their Lagos owners while they awaited sale to a foreign exporter. Further winnowing took place. Some of each gender were retained locally, for a time at least. Women, however, were in particular demand for their labor and as concubines. The narrative of Thomas King reports that his mother was owned by 6 or 7 Africans, at least 2 in Lagos itself. At this stage also, their gender spared some women and girls from entering the Atlantic trade. Only about 34% of enslaved Africans who entered only about 30% of the enslaved Africans who entered the Atlantic commerce along the Bight of Benin were female. Sale in Lagos to an Oyinbo, as foreign slave traders were called, marked the enslaved first encounter with race. The word was usually translated into English as white man, though it did not bear that explicit connotation in Yoruba. Ethnicity played a role in local slavery, but race, status determined biologically and defined by color and other physiological traits as culturally constructed in the Western Atlantic, did not exist among the Yoruba. Following this moment of sale, few of the enslaved were ever again permanently free of the subordination, insults, and suffering that race imposed on them and justified ideologically in the minds of most Americans and Europeans. All of the enslaved Africans shipped from Lagos, for whom narratives survive, spent time between a week and 3 months on shore prior to being loaded onto a slave ship. Crowther and Joseph Wright famously described their experiences bodies. Crowther wrote of being fettered around the neck and then chained to other males in a manner that bruised and suffocated him. Females, he said, fared no better. Wright grieved for 50 similarly restrained Africans who were burned to death when the barracoon where they were being held caught fire. The day of loading onto the slave ship brought further suffering. First, the forced march to the beach, bound and shackled, naked and cold. Then the searing of greased flesh by a red-hot iron bearing the distinguishing mark of the shipper. If you look at this manifest from the Santa Ana over here on the far left, you see the brand of each loader reproduced. Pedro Pacheco's was simply a P. Cries of pain, the stench of scorched skin pierced the air. Next, a second water torture. Men, women, and children were forced this time into ocean-going canoes, whose paddlers fought their way through heavy surf to the vessel offshore. The day Joseph Wright was loaded, one of the canoes capsized and half of its human cargo drowned. Sharks frequented the waters off Lagos. It's not fanciful to imagine victims being eaten. Poles prodded men, women, and children up swaying rope ladders. Whips and guns drove them across the hot main deck and down the narrow hatch into the dark slave hold. A few of the torturous instruments of the trade have found their way into a slave relics museum that the Mobe family has created in Badagry. The Nigerian multimedia artist Ndidi Dike has integrated some such instruments into a work of hers. And here you see shackles and leg irons and branding irons and a branding iron hanging here. These bottles are probably intended to represent spirits that were traded for slaves. I don't know where Ndidi found these posters advertising enslaved Africans for sale. I doubt that she found them along the coast of Lagos because most of them are indeed in English. Below deck, men, women, and children were separated. Adults of both sexes were rarely allowed more than about 3 1/3 cubic feet of space. Bare skin rubbed against rough planks, splinters, bruises, tears, thirst, hunger, nausea, exhaustion, fury and fear at leaving the continent of their birth to be taken they knew not where. Wright reported a pervasive belief among the enslaved that they were being taken to white man's country to be eaten. Everyday consumption of other kinds, in fact, lay ahead. As the enslaved suffered, they talked, comforting and consoling one another, strengthening bonds that had begun to form on land, planning and plotting ways to survive. Now scale this tableau. In the 1840s, it was the practice at Lagos to load hundreds of slaves as fast as possible to avoid the British cruisers. In 1843, for example, 20 canoes carrying 30 slaves each loaded 539 enslaved Africans onto a vessel in a single hour. Imagine the ordeal I've just described under those conditions. Imagine the strength, resourcefulness, and courage needed to survive. Time doesn't permit me to pursue the materiality of enslaved bodies through the Atlantic crossing or into slavery in Brazil or Cuba. Nor can I discuss the rich gendered and ritualized material contributions of Africans, many of them Yoruba speakers, who arrived in Brazil and Cuba from Lagos and other ports along the Bight of Benin during the 19th century. Fortunately, a rich literature is developing on those subjects. I'll stay focused on Lagos during the time remaining. The Atlantic slave trade from Lagos ended abruptly in 1851 when Britain bombarded the port in the name of abolition. In this instance, the settlement's island location was a detriment, making it vulnerable to attack by sea. The bombardment damaged the town and port severely. At that time, the British drove a powerful Oba from the throne and replaced him with a compliant ally. The kingdom remained nominally independent for another decade, but in the 1850s, the British consul was the power behind the throne, raising again the question of when the port became colonial. By 1866, the Atlantic slave trade had ended from the region as a whole. Since the 1830s, a new trade in palm oil, long produced and consumed locally, had been developing on the coast to supply growing European markets for vegetable oils, which industrialization and urbanization there were creating. By the time of final abolition in 1866, the value of the palm oil and the palm kernel trades from the port had surpassed that of the slave trade at its peak. The commercial transition at Lagos, as the transformation of external trade has been called, altered patterns in the transatlantic circulation of people and commodities in the port and elsewhere along the littoral of the Bight of Benin. Trade with Brazil did not end, but it declined greatly in volume and value relative to that with Britain, Germany, and France. Under pressure from the British consul, the Oba expelled the freeborn Lusophone merchants from the town, and few of them ever returned. Henceforth, the large-scale, well-capitalized foreign merchants in the port came from Europe. What happened to the enslaved? Warfare and thus capture, enslavement, and their associated horrors continued in the hinterland. Tragically, following the abolition of the external trade, most of the African men, women, and children enslaved were retained within West Africa, many within the region. Palm produce production and trade were very labor intensive, and initially they were women's work. Many enslaved women and girls were from the 1850s put to work in these activities, which were expanding to meet European demand. Some of the males were employed in harvesting palm nuts. More were used to transport heavy palm oil to the port by headload and canoe. The long marches carrying heavy loads on the head continued. Elsewhere, I've argued that in this period, slavery changed within the region. The value of enslaved people's labor became more important relative to other contributions they made. Local slavery became, in this regard, more like the American chattel variety. In the early years, the expansion of the palm produce trade increased the wealth and power of successful female palm oil producers and traders relative to males in their households and communities. Some free women rose on the backs of the labor of the slaves they owned. Pretty quickly, however, males began to look for new ways to restrain women, including through masquerades and secret societies. And wealthy men began moving into large-scale palm oil production using the gendered labor of their female slaves. What were the consequences for the enslaved? On balance, I think they were better off being retained in Africa than exported to Brazil or Cuba. First, they were spared the brutal and deadly warehousing in Lagos and shipment across the Atlantic. Between 1820 and 1851, about 8% of the Africans embarked from Bight of Benin ports died en route to Brazil or Cuba. Second, while African slavery was by no means a benign institution, On balance, enslaved people in West Africa enjoyed better opportunities than their counterparts in Brazil and Cuba for themselves or their children to move up and out of slavery. Moreover, they had more scope to be incorporated as rights-bearing members of local kin groups and communities. Ethnicity, as I've said, played a role in West Africa. Memories of origin can persist to this day and disqualify descendants from certain rights and opportunities. But slavery in Africa wasn't race-based. Moreover, among the Yoruba and elsewhere, ideologies that underpinned slavery emphasized incorporation. No color bar that even in Brazil and Cuba was difficult to transcend haunted peoples of slave origin in Lagos, among the Yoruba, or across the region until the high colonial intervened, and then it affected Blacks regardless of their backgrounds. The descendants of enslaved populations in Africa have not had to contend with the systematic racism that has plagued Blacks in the Americas across generations. The final questions I want to pursue are the impacts of abolition and British intervention on the African freed people from Brazil and Cuba who had begun to settle in Lagos in the 1840s. The Oba was not forced to expel them from Lagos, even though some of them had been involved in the slave trade. The British consuls in the 1850s and colonial administrators in the 1860s evaluated them positively and thought they were just the kind of Blacks the port needed to develop. British officials supported the freed slaves from the Americas, who frequently aligned with them. These changes and others taking place in Brazil and Cuba attracted new, larger, and more diverse streams of Brazilian and Cuban immigration to the town. In particular, women and children began to return to Lagos in significant numbers for the first time. The small number of male migrants in the 1840s had intermarried with local women, encouraging integration into indigenous kin groups and culture. Only once the freedmen began marrying and establishing families with women from similar backgrounds as their own did an Afro-Brazilian community with a distinctive identity and set of cultural practices begin to form. Aguda, it's really a synonym for Afro-Brazilian, Aguda women are remembered as having shouldered responsibility for the introduction and preservation of Brazilian cuisine and popular Islamic and Catholic religious festivals in Lagos, both of which were central to the definition of Afro-Brazilian identity in the town. I've argued that in the era of the slave trade, enslaved and freed Africans who traveled back and forth between Bahia and Lagos, as well as other ports along the littoral of the Bight of Benin, were in the forefront of the trade in commodities, textiles, palm oil, cola nuts, baskets, gourd, and beads, and in the circulation of knowledge required to reproduce Yoruba and other African cultures in Brazil. I'll just take a moment to show you an image of some of the textiles that were traded from West Africa to Brazil and were very popular among Africans. There are also beads that were important in the trade. Both types of exchange, both the commercial and the cultural, became more difficult after abolition because the number of ships moving back and forth across the ocean between the two places declined precipitously. Some freed men adapted to the changing opportunities in trade by becoming middlemen in the palm produce trade, although none of them broke into the import-export trade with Europeans. Others farmed on the mainland. Still others practiced skilled crafts that they learned in Brazil or Cuba. The freed women who returned worked as food sellers as they had in Brazil, or they purveyed domestic services such as laundry and sewing. Brazilian passport and custom records show, however, that despite the decline in shipping, freed Africans and Creoles from Brazil continued to travel back and forth in pursuit of trade and to preserve their transatlantic family and religious networks. Some maintained commercial relations with agents in Salvador, Rio, and Recife, who sent them trade goods and received and sold others shipped to them from across the Atlantic. A few such traders who prospered and became wealthy in the 70s and 80s are famous: Walter Seafray, M.J. de Santa Anna, the Daroches, father and son. Ultimately, I think these big traders were less important in the maintenance of transatlantic commerce, social and cultural ties, in the ongoing exchange between West Africa and Brazil, than the much larger number of now largely forgotten small-scale traders. In closing, I'll mention one further important consequence of abolition and the British intervention for the freed people and Creoles who returned to Lagos from the Americas. Those who arrived between the 1840s and 1860s were able, given indigenous land tenure, to acquire access to land in the port, a part of the island known as Faji, for very limited capital outlay. Shortly after the annexation, the colonial government made it possible for them to obtain crown grants to the land that secured their title to it. This security and tenure enabled the returnees to establish a neighborhood of their own in Lagos, where they lived in close proximity to one another and to their shrines, mosques, and Catholic Church. In this neighborhood, they built houses and other structures using distinctive building techniques, styles, and sometimes materials. Through the development of their quarter, Faji, the Afro-Brazilians helped reconstruct Lagos following its destruction in 1851. Faji, the so-called Brazilian quarter, is the Afro-Brazilians and the Afro-Cubans' most visible and lasting legacy in Lagos. Faji, this quarter that the Afro-Brazilians built, is usually identified with Roman Catholicism. In fact, the word aguda tends to be used as a synonym for Roman Catholicism. In fact, many of the returnees were Muslim. And this last slide shows a picture taken in 2010 of one of the mosques they built in the Afro-Brazilian style at the intersection of Bamboche Street and Joseph Street in Lagos. This is Salvador Mosque, named not after the port of Salvador in Bahia, but after its founder, whose first name was Salvador Ramos das Neves. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Kristin, for this rich and very rich and thought-provoking lecture. There was many things in there, much food for thought. We have time for questions and answers, so I would like to invite everyone to either raise their hands, mention questions in the chat,